Following wins for Kimi in Spain and then Monaco, we headed to the Nürburgring for the European GP in May. McLaren were on a roll, eager to eat into Alonso's championship lead. And as the race got underway, things were looking good. Kimi led the race on lap 1, but then a massive lock-up under braking heavily flat-spotted his right front tyre. The new rules for 2005 prevented us from changing tyres at pit stops, so the damaged Michelin had to stay in place. Hello everybody, welcome back to another Tales from the Treehouse. Straight off the bat, I'm going to apologise for all of the noise, the creaking, the groaning. This treehouse is creaking under the strain of the wind today, but I hope you can hear me. And as you've probably figured out, I'm talking today about that race at the Nürburgring back in 2005, where we at McLaren with Kimi Räikkönen came so close to winning the race in the most unlikely of circumstances, and yet in the very last moments it all fell apart, literally. Kimi continued to lead the race while simultaneously holding off Fernando, but everyone knew that the vibrations from the damaged tyre were causing significant problems elsewhere. And this was the thing, we'd had this big lock-up into the first part of the race on lap 1, which had been much more significant than people had first realised. Yeah, it was a big lock-up. You saw the tyre smoke on the monitors, and everybody watching at home will have seen the same. But what we started to very quickly realise, that the effects of that lock-up were way more significant than it first appeared. The vibrations that were being caused through the car as the tyre that had this great big flat section, a bit like a 50p piece, rolling constantly over the tarmac, bumping every time it went onto the flat spot, sending shockwaves and vibrations through the rest of the car. We could see that on the data. You could even see it on the camera, the onboard camera, as the race went on, and this damage, the flat spotted tyre got worse and worse and worse. When you have a flat spot, every time you go into a corner and hit the brakes, the tyre naturally wants to settle on that flat section, and the chances of locking up in the same place again become greater and greater and greater. Our technical bods were very concerned about the stresses, loads and vibrations going through the suspension components. They were being pushed well over their design limits. On the radio, we discussed our options. Should we retire the car or slow the pace to protect the car and yet concede position to Renault? Should we bring the car in and change the tyre anyway, with the idea that we could later argue the decision to the stewards on safety grounds and therefore claim that it wasn't a breach of the rules? But that would also meant conceding track position to Renault. It was one of those really difficult scenarios to work out what the right thing to do was. Of course, safety was absolutely paramount. The last thing we wanted to do was put the driver, Kimi, and anyone else around the racetrack at risk. And so we had to very carefully monitor what we thought the risk of failure would be up against the risk or the reward of staying out in front and holding on to the race. We were in a championship fight, let's not forget, with Fernando Alonso. This was a chance for Kimi to really make his name in the world of Formula One. And along with that, it's the same for us. Kimi was struggling out on the racetrack. The vibrations are blurring my vision. Every time I do that, it gets more Russian. The vibrations are blurring my vision, he shouted over the radio. And I believed him too, you know, he was not the kind of character to moan unnecessarily. He was giving us that feedback, that information, so we knew just how serious it was, and we could see it as well. We could see every time the camera switched to the onboard view just how much it was shaking, how it was blurring the camera vision. So imagine how bad that must have been for the driver strapped solidly into that car. You know, we could hear it as well. Every time the car went past the pit straight, you could hear the flat spot of the tyre clipping the tarmac on every revolution. This really unique and loud sound that was different to every other car. And the discussions that we were having inside the garage on the team radio were becoming more and more stressful, more and more panicked. We realised that the situation was becoming more and more serious as time went on. And in the end, these discussions that were going back and forward between the pit wall, the garage, Woking back in the UK as well, got to a point where we thought, we're going to have to ask Kimi. We need to know. Kimi's the guy behind the wheel. We need to give him the choice, the final decision on what happens here. So we gave him the information on the radio. We gave him our understanding. of what the chances were of failure. And then we said to Kimi, what do you want to do? We keep going, he said determinedly. Even if we'd ordered him to retire the car, I suspect Kimi would have ignored us and probably kept racing anyway. It's just the kind of character that he was. He was all or nothing, and that's partly what we loved about him. He gave it everything, we gave it everything in return because of that. And together, that's what we were like. We were all or bust. And I love that about Kimi. Somehow he held on to the lead, keeping Alonso well back in a brilliant, brilliant drive, despite the vibrations becoming louder and visibly more violent. We'd been on the edge of our seats, but finally we headed into the last lap of the race with Alonso in second, closing slightly. All we needed was for Kimi to hold on to the finish line. One more lap, that's all we needed. It would have been the most amazing victory for us as a team and of course for Kimi, let alone what it would have done for our championship hopes that year, which were great. You know, we had great championship hopes. We'd come so close 2 years earlier in 2003. 2005 felt like a genuine opportunity where we had the car to do it, we had the people to do it, we certainly had the driver to do it. And this victory here at the Nürburgring would have been one major step closer, not only because it was a victory for us, but because we'd outscored and outraced the great Fernando Alonso in his Renault. Going into that last lap, Kimi hit the brakes for turn 1 for the very final time in the race. The right front suspension fell apart. I watched in horror as our car span off into the gravel trap on just 3 wheels. My heart sank. I couldn't believe it. And when I say my heart sank, this is where the part of the story becomes very personal for me, because what I just watched on TV is the part of the car that I was responsible for, the front end of Kimi's car. That was my job at the time, Kimi's front end mechanic. And I'd seen the front suspension literally collapse, fall apart in front of my eyes, and the car spin off at incredibly high speed into the gravel trap. That was what my eyes saw, that was what my brain took in. It totally disconnected those images from what had been going on all race in that moment for me. The fact that these vibrations had been getting more and more severe, the loads through the suspension becoming more and more abnormal, more and more unique because of the flat-spotted tyre. In my head, I just saw my bit of the car fall apart. And I remember sinking in my chair, gutted because we clearly weren't going to win the race, and Fernando went on to win it easily without a fight from us. So that was devastating in itself. But much more than that was this fear that maybe the car had fallen apart because I'd done something wrong. Had I not built it properly, had I not done something up correctly, had I just made some kind of mistake that had cost us so dearly but also so publicly. It's a tree branch falling down. I was in shock. It was a reaction I'd never experienced before, but my mind had just seen the part of the car I was responsible for fall apart when leading the race on the final lap. Was it something I'd left loose? Was it something I'd forgotten to do or installed correctly? Was Kimi okay? I walked outside to the back of the garage and sat down against the wall, racking my brains, consumed with guilt that I wasn't even sure was appropriate to have. And that was the thing. I was overwhelmed and literally consumed. I took myself off to one side in that moment. I sat at the back of the garage. I smoked occasionally back then, as pretty much everybody did in that paddock, because every team was sponsored by a cigarette company, and we were being given more free cigarettes than you knew what to do with. I only smoked occasionally, but on that afternoon, following that race, I must have smoked 5 on the trot. Sat down, slumped against the back of the garages, just smoking one after another, going through this disastrous scenario in my head. If it had been my fault, the whole world knew about it. How could I go back into the garage and hold my head up if I'd done something so wrong that had been so significant? How could I walk in and face my teammates again? How could I face Kimi when he came back to the garage? I knew by this point that Kimi was okay, which was obviously a huge relief. But how could I face him, knowing that I may have let him down? How could I walk out into the paddock when every other mechanic in the pit lane knew that I was the front end guy for Kimi's car, and that part of the car had just fallen apart? These disastrous scenarios were racing through my mind. to the point where I couldn't think of anything else. My colleagues kept coming out one at a time, as they always did at the end of a race, have a quick cigarette, have a quick chat, and then they'd disappear again. And I stayed slumped in the same position, just going from one cigarette to another, moping around, feeling depressed. It was a situation I'd never been in before, and whilst I can sit back and look at it now and say, well, that's ridiculous, because of course it was to do with the fact that he'd flat spotted the tyre and the vibrations had destroyed the suspension. But in that moment, I couldn't see it. And it was a real kind of visualization of what race mechanics and engineers and team members put into these operations. It's much more than just a job. You are fully invested in the process of trying to get your car to the finish line as quickly as possible. My paranoia was increasing. Eventually, our chief engineer joined me as I wallowed in self-pity and insecurity. He explained that the vibrations seen in our data were so extreme that it was no surprise the pushrod had failed in that way. It had simply shaken itself to bits. The relief was immense. Those reassuring words were all I needed in that moment to set my own mind back at ease again. It was strange, now that I look back, to think how your mind can disconnect from reality in a moment like that, when the stresses and the pressure builds up. And that's it. When you're in a championship fight in a Formula One team, the pressure is so great that it can, if you're not careful, totally consume you. And moments like that can tip people over the edge. For a short period of time, that's what it did to me. But just to hear somebody of responsibility, somebody with the data to prove that it hadn't been my mistake, and that of course it was to do with this horrendous flat spot. To hear somebody say those words was all it took to let that slip away and let me come back to reality, hold my head up, pick myself up, get back inside the garage. And yeah, we were all gutted about the end result, but that's what it boiled down to, the end result. It wasn't about what had led us to it, what had happened on the way. And when Kimi came back in, you know, we all commiserated each other, but no one blamed each other. And the reality is, even if I had made a mistake on that day, I know that nobody would have blamed me openly. The team would have put their arms around me and would have supported me, because that's what we did. That's what you do in a great team. But it's so hard in those moments to try and envisage that when you're in the midst of it. And I think it sums up the idea of pressure. And it's not just about when you're in a championship fight. Of course, in those situations, the pressure escalates. Formula One is all about pressure. And that particular day taught me an awful lot about dealing with it. I didn't deal with it very well in that moment. Those reassuring words from our chief engineer were all I needed to bring me back. Yes, I was still gutted along with everyone else, but at least I hadn't let my team down, which would have been far, far worse. And that is the point. It's about teammates putting their arms around each other, pulling together. The only way that you win a world championship, the only way you have any success in anything, is if every part of the team that you're in, or every part of the process, comes together and works perfectly at exactly the moment you need it to happen. I was very relieved to know that I hadn't let my team down, but I do also know that if I had on that day, if I had made a mistake, it wouldn't have been the end of the world. My team would have put their arm around me, they would have supported me, they would have looked after me. I wouldn't have been cast out like some kind of reject. That's not how the best teams work. We built the strongest team I've ever been a part of during that period of time, working with Kimi, with that set of mechanics, with that set of engineers. And what that particular race taught us on that day is that we were an incredible team. And no matter what it took, we were going to go for it with that championship, even if it meant laying everything on the line, putting everything at risk. It was going to be a year where it was all or nothing for us. Kimi had summed that up in his response on the radio about whether we should continue or retire the car. And that was exactly what we all took forward from the rest of the year. And 2005 ended up being one of my most enjoyable years, despite the fact that in the end, we did narrowly miss out on winning the title. We came very, very close. And that happened not necessarily because we had the standout best car. We had a car that was fragile on many occasions. But I firmly believe we had the best team on our side of the garage that particular year. I hope you enjoyed that one. Another Tales from the Treehouse done. I hope you can hear me over the creaking and groaning. Hopefully the treehouse will survive for another one of these. As always, I'd love to know what you'd like me to cover in more episodes of this, so drop me a line in the comments. Let me know if you've liked it and what else you'd like me to talk about in a Tales from the Treehouse episode. For now though, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Ta-da.